was on the brink of American entry into World War I. The John Haynes home spoke the following words to his Unitarian congregation at the Community Church of New York City. Words which capture for me the obligations of a religious community in the face of war. In this church, Holmes said, in this church, if nowhere else in this country, the enemy will be included in the family of God's children. And he went on to add, so long as I am minister, this altar shall be consecrated to human community, and before it shall be offered worship only to that one Spirit which has made of one blood all nations to dwell together on earth. Today, it's about 100 years later, Memorial Day 2017. Today, may we pray for our souls. Symbol of light and of knowledge, symbol of warmth and freedom. We light this chalice as a symbol of our faith. Here we gather to celebrate hope and the infinite possibilities of love. May we open our service, turning our hymn books, please, to number 159. The great poet Adrian Rich once wrote, "There come times, perhaps this is one of them, when we have to take ourselves seriously or die. When we have to pull back from the incantations, rhythms we have moved to thoughtlessly, and disenthrall ourselves, bestow ourselves to silence or a more severe listening, cleansed of oratory, formulas, choruses, laments, or static crowding of the wires." May we join our minds and our hearts in the spirit of prayer and reflection this morning. O Spirit of life and love, Spirit of that hoped-for peace, this is one of those times when we have to take ourselves more seriously or die. On this Memorial Day, we remember how carelessly we toy with life. Do we forget that those men and women we send into harm's way were once cradled in their mother's arms? Do we forget that each of them carry within themselves the dreams of their parents, the hopes of their lovers, the needs of their children? If we remembered all this and let it truly touch our hearts, would we ship them off into the jungles and deserts of the world? What is so disheartening this day is that our nation conspires with bullies, so-called strong men from around the world where the light of democracy has grown dim. We believe now that our objectives can be achieved quickly by force and that brute power works best. May we pray for our nation to opt for reconciliation rather than mindless conflict. May we recall the words of Thomas Mann: "War is a coward's escape from the problems of peace." War is a coward's escape from the problems of peace. We can't just wish for peace. We have to will it, suffer for it, demand it from our government as if peace were God's most cherished hope for humanity, as indeed it is. This is one of those times when we have to take ourselves seriously or die. Amen. I'm sure that just about everyone here, perhaps not 100%, but pretty darn close. All of us have a lot of Could you call him back, Bill, after that? Sure, we all have a lot of feeling for the exercise of civil disobedience. We may not personally want to necessarily practice it ourselves, but we certainly understand to a large degree why people do that. And our reading this morning by Albert Smith Bigelow is his justification of why he engages in civil disobedience. In fact, the civil disobedience that he did engage in sailing into the Pacific bomb test area in the 1950s. And when he gives these very compelling reasons of why he feels so motivated to take part in civil disobedience, at least I ask myself, what's wrong with me? Why am I not out there at the front lines myself? But before we go right into his reasons, I just want to tell you a little bit about Bigelow. He served in the U.S. Navy during World War II. He was captain of a destroyer escort which sailed into Pearl Harbor on August 6, 1945. And when he heard of the news of the atomic explosion over Hiroshima, he resigned immediately from the Navy. And it was 1 month before he was eligible for pension. He and his wife Sylvia became Quakers, and through the Society of Friends, they housed 2 of the Hiroshima young maidens. And these were young Japanese women severely disfigured by the effects of the bomb. They were brought to the United States to undergo plastic surgery in 1955. And that was right about the time Bigelow attempted to deliver a 17,000 signature petition to the White House opposing atmospheric nuclear testing. Surprise, he never got into the White House. Tried many times and concluded that other measures had to be taken. So February 1958, Bigelow set sail into the atomic energy test site in the Marshall Islands. He was on a 30-foot ship called the Golden Rule. Now, this trip was greatly publicized, and the Atomic Energy Commission hastily issued a regulation banning U.S. citizens from sailing into the proving grounds. Well, needless to say, this did not stop Bigelow and his crew. On their second attempt, they were arrested by the Coast Guard and sentenced to 60 days in jail. And while the Golden Rule was docked in Honolulu, Earl and Barbara Reynolds met with Bigelow. Earl was an anthropologist who had studied the effects of the atomic bomb on Japanese society. Hearing the plight of the Golden Rule, Earl and Barbara Reynolds felt inspired to take their own nonviolent action, and later that year, their yacht, called the Phoenix of Hiroshima, became the first vessel to enter a nuclear zone at Bikini Atoll. Earl was sentenced to 6 months in jail. So here's the rationale of Bigelow. Why I am sailing into the Pacific bomb test area. I am going because, as Shakespeare said, action is eloquence. Without some such direct action, ordinary citizens lack the power any longer to be seen or heard by their government. I'm going because it is time to do something about peace, not just talk about peace. I'm going because, like all men, in my heart I know that all nuclear explosions are monstrous, evil, unworthy of human beings. I'm going because war is no longer a futile jousting match. It is an unthinkable catastrophe for all people. I'm going because it is now the little children, and most of all, the as yet unborn, who are the front-line troops. It is my duty to stand between them and this horrible danger. I'm going because it is cowardly and degrading for me to stand by any longer, to consent, and thus to collaborate in atrocities. I am going because, as Gandhi said, God sits in the man opposite me. Therefore, to injure him is to injure God himself. I'm going to witness to the deep inward truth that we all know. Force can subdue, but love gains. I am going because, however mistaken, unrighteous, and unrepentant governments may seem, I still believe all men are really good at heart, and that my act will speak to them. I am going in the hope of helping change the hearts and minds of men in government. If necessary, I am willing to give my life to help change a policy of fear, force, and destruction to one of trust, kindness, and help. I am going in order to say, quit this waste, this arms race. Turn instead to a disarmament race. Stop competing for evil. Compete for good. I'm going because I have to, if I am to call myself a human being. When you see something horrible happening, your instinct is to do something about it. You can freeze in fearful apathy, or you can even talk yourself into saying that it isn't that horrible. I can't do that. I have to act. This is too horrible. We know it. We know it. Let's all act. This is a great Sunday to be in church, because on this Sunday, the choir is going to thank you for all your support during the year in all their fundraising events. And so they are going to turn the tables. And the coffee hour will not just be a coffee hour, but it's going to be champagne. This is free. Free. Mimosas and as many bagels as you can possibly stuff into your mouth. It is all there. And your pockets. Oh, okay. How stale are these bagels? No, just still left over from October. And not only are we going to have a champagne and mimosa coffee hour, we are going to flaunt it, because we're going to do it right on the patio. And as people cruise by 13th East, they'll look at this church and everybody's sipping champagne. It's going to be exciting. Hope Fox News drives by and just captures it. Next Sunday will also be an exciting time to be at church. We're not going to have mimosas, but what we're going to do is the only time the whole season we're going to actually just have a 9 o'clock service. It's going to be a shortened service so that it will allow people to go to Pride Parade if they're so moved. And I tell you, a lot of people do want to do that. And this is kind of a nice tune up or get your mind in the right frame before going to the Pride Parade. That's what the service is all about. Short enough service to make sure everybody will get downtown by 10 o'clock when the Pride Parade begins. We will be meeting at our Unitarian Church. If you're going to hopefully march with us, we'll be meeting at, on 200 West between 1st and 2nd South. If you had trouble finding us, there are two things. We are number 77. Each unit has a number. We're number 77. And you can't miss the huge banner standing on the side of love. So I hope that we're going to have a nice turnout. And please remember to bring water. It's probably going to be a little warm next Sunday. And last year we had actually a float where we had water for people. But this time we're not going to have a float. Bring your own water. So 9 o'clock next Sunday, a brief service, and then off we go together. Please take a look at all the really exciting announcements in the order of service. On the 11th of June, we're going to have the church picnic, of course, and we're going to have our new assistant minister, Monica Dobbins, who will be joining us. And so, yeah, we've got a lot of exciting things ahead of us. This time, the offering will be gratefully received, a chance to greet one another, greet your neighbors, and just, discuss how much champagne you're going to be drinking this morning. Well, Memorial Day for me always arrives with layers of complexity. There's no one grave that I visit specifically. Once every so often, I remember a few old buddies of mine who lost their lives in Vietnam. One in particular was part of my high school youth group in the Unitarian church in which I grew up. Most of us Unitarian kids went to the safety of college campuses. But this red-headed kid named Jay felt an obligation to serve the military. I never really quite tracked it, really understood this sense of obligation. What did he really mean by that? Where did this come from? Because after all, by 1967, it was clear that fighting in Vietnam had nothing to do with defending our nation, despite earlier rhetoric about the threat of communism. Whatever the bizarre rationale, our nation was sending its young men into a foreign jungle to kill men, women, and children for reasons none of the soldiers from the U.S. really understood. On one of his trips back home, Jay tried to explain his assignment of patrolling the rivers in the Mekong Delta, where the banks were so thick with foliage, he knew for certain that a sniper would snuff his life out like that. I told him, don't go back. Don't go back. And he said, I didn't understand. And so there we were, each of us not understanding the other. His premonition came true. I think of war more generically and ponder the number of wars I've witnessed in just my lifetime alone. It's a stunning number. From Korea to Southeast Asia to Central America to all those wars in the Middle East. It can make you think that war is just a natural byproduct of life itself. And this is how we deal. This is how we've always dealt and how we continue to deal. And it's so strange. I mean, nobody ever really understood why we declared war on the island of Grenada in the West Indies. Grenada didn't exactly represent a threat to the United States. It was just a matter of course. There never does seem to be any logic in exercising war anywhere. It's hard to distinguish our ongoing practice of war, where conventional armies battle it out on some turf far away from our nation. It's hard to distinguish this real war from the classic anti-war movie King of Hearts. That was a film in which, if you recall, mental patients were freed from their asylum, came out and observed two lines of soldiers facing each other on a field, shooting each other dead at point blank, and the last one standing supposedly won. The patients, believing this was all too weird, went back to the asylum and locked the door behind them. Of course. So if conventional warfare is hard to fathom, then how do we deal with the apocalyptic dread of a nuclear war? I mean, this dread, beyond our wildest imaginings, this dread has lain mostly dormant for much of our lives, and yet it has suddenly reawakened. And the resumption, as unbelievable as it sounds, we are now resuming a nuclear arms race and threats and so many unclear policies. President Trump tells us we need to be extremely vigilant and extremely careful when it comes to nuclear. But he refuses to rule out conducting a first strike, even in Europe. In his words, Europe is a big place. Okay. Last December, Vladimir Putin told military leaders in Moscow that he intended to bolster Russia's nuclear arsenal. Let it be an arms race, Trump said in response. We will outmatch them at every pass and outlast them all. Is it not a certain peculiarity how easily we human beings threaten to bring about the end of the world? You know, if we look at the whole nuclear age, inclusive of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as those tense crises in Cuba and Berlin, and all the angst those Cold War pressure points aroused, it remains positively shocking that the apocalyptic dread still hangs over our lives today. In fact, it's even gotten worse. This all kind of serves as a mirror of our incompetence or lack of will in eradicating nuclear weapons. The choice between letting life on Earth continue or letting the missiles fly and sending Earth back to the Creator from whence it came. This decision rests solely in human hands. And what adds to the fright of it all is our inability to get a handle on what this accumulated human power really means and what we can do about it. You know, our failure to understand the magnitude of using or not using nuclear warheads has plagued us for a long time, actually. I look back with some embarrassment at our ineptness in remotely grasping this perilous situation when we rehearsed air raid drills in my elementary school years. I distinctly remember two exercises. One where we had to duck under our desks upon the command of our teacher. And secondly, when we had to grab our coats and sit out in the hallway of the school waiting for a teacher to scream out, "Take cover," upon which we had to make sure we were entirely under our coats. A surefire prevention against nuclear war. Now, these procedures raised my anxiety as a second grader. And I told my mother that the worst of it was that in the event of a nuclear war, parents couldn't come to school to pick up their children. It would not be safe. My mother, who never did follow rules very well, swore that nobody was going to keep her from entering the school and taking me home in a nuclear war. But this worried me more. I prayed there would not be a war so my mother wouldn't have to break the rules and take me home in front of all my classmates. It was so embarrassing just to think about that. Meanwhile, some of the great prophets of the 1950s and early 60s try to philosophize, understand, explain somewhat these unthinkable horrors that would be unleashed by a nuclear explosion. Bertrand Russell, writing from an English jail, he too was arrested for civil disobedience. In his essay, he wrote his salutation to all who are capable of sane thinking and human feeling. And in that essay, he explained the delusion of believing Kennedy and Khrushchev professing to stand for great causes. There is no cause that justifies the end of human life. He wrote, you, your families, your friends, your country are to be exterminated by the common decision of a few brutal but powerful men. To please these men, all the private affections, all the public hopes, all that has been achieved in art and knowledge and thought, and all that might be achieved hereafter is to be wiped out forever. Our ruined, lifeless planet, he said, will continue for countless ages to circle aimlessly around the sun, unredeemed by the joys and loves, the occasional wisdom, and the power to create beauty, which have given value to human life. The true criminals, according to Bertrand Russell, are those who perpetuate the idea that there will be somehow, unexplainable, that somehow they're going to be safe places to live and work far away from the effects of a nuclear war. There will be no safe places. And this whole idea parallels Trump's belief that Europe is a very big place, so there is room to drop a nuclear bomb if we need to because it's so big. Albert Camus wrote, the 17th century was the century of mathematics, the 18th century that of the physical sciences, the 19th century that of biology. Our 20th century is the century of fear. Now, I will be told that fear is not a science, but science must be somewhat involved since its latest theoretical advances have brought it to the point of negating itself, while its perfected technology threatens the globe itself with destruction. We are cut off from the future. Life has no validity unless it can project itself towards the future, that it can ripen, progress. And he continues, today history seems to be in the grip of blind and deaf forces which will heed neither cries of warning, nor advice, nor entreaties. The years we have just gone through, and this is a reference to dropping the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the years we have just gone through have killed something in us. And that something is simply the old confidence man had in himself, which led him to believe that he could always elicit human reactions from another man if he spoke to him in a language of a common humanity. The concept of a common humanity has been obliterated from today's world. The notion common humanity has practically been erased from our language and from our thinking. This only makes our dread of a nuclear apocalypse feel increasingly inescapable. What has not changed over the many decades is how this issue is framed. Either we summon whatever human qualities we have to ensure life on this planet, or we let the missiles fly and send the earth back to its maker. Now, if we are any the wiser today, and I use wisdom loosely, if we're any wiser about our dilemma in facing extinction, it's not that we are merely at the mercy of a few powerful and possibly misguided national leaders, but that we are divided on the veracity of climate science. Arguments about nuclear weapons in the 50s, as well as today, are fundamentally tied to the debate over global warming. It all hinges not on whether a bomb blast will wipe out all of life, but it all hinges on the climate effect of nuclear war. That which will create what is often termed a nuclear winter would be caused not by a blast itself, but caused by smoke from the fires started by these nuclear explosions, especially the black, sooty smoke from cities and industrial facilities, heated by the sun, spread globally, lasting for infinite number of years, preventing crop growth, producing mass starvation. The intense soot shot through the atmosphere will cause ozone depletion and all the ill effects associated with that. Now, since this is only a theory that can never be tested in the real world, denial that scientific predictions of this magnitude could ever take place, these denials were just as ripe 60 years ago as they are today in our controversy over global warming. The Harvard historian Jill Lepore offers a brilliant evolution of denial, denying the effects of nuclear war from the early days of the Cold War to our present predicament. She writes that weapons and weather are forever twisted together. Weapons and weather. You can't separate it. Disputes about the future of the planet are not about the bomb itself. It's all about climate. What does depletion of the ozone layer really mean? It's always been contested. In 1962, the U.S. government formed the Environmental Pollution Panel of the President's Science Advisory Committee. It laid out, with much alarm, invisible pollutants for the planet as a whole. And then in the mid-60s, atmospheric physicists worked on global effects of environmental pollution and the effects on climate. In the 70s, our military funded research into the environmental effects of nuclear weapons. In 1974, the U.S. Arms Control and Disarmament Agency asked the National Academy of Sciences to prepare a report on the effects of nuclear explosion on the ozone. 1982, Representative Al Gore, convened hearings into the consequences of nuclear war on the global environment. The data came from computer models. So yeah, difficult to prove 100%. And so the battle began between those who were willing to place their faith in the speculation of military strategists and those who were willing to place their faith in the speculations of environmental scientists. One of the leading environmental scientists at that time was Carl Sagan. His papers on nuclear winter were smeared by the Wall Street Journal, Edward Teller, who was Reagan's strategic defense initiative enthusiast, the Heritage Foundation, Richard Pearl, and William F. Buckley, to name a few. There were too many uncertainties, these critics claimed, casting doubt on whether or not a nuclear winter could ever really happen in the first place. Sagan said nuclear winter had the consensus of more than 100 scientists around the world. Buckley said Sagan was arrogant. Edward Teller went on to argue that spreading the fear of nuclear winter was merely a political tool used by climate scientists. Sound familiar? It served no good purpose. 2 years later, the George C. Marshall Institute was founded, which had scientists proclaim, and I quote, "The nuclear winter scenario could not serve the needs of Soviet leaders better if it had been designed for that purpose." And so from there, it was really an easy leap later in the 80s for Exxon, Shell, Arco to state their position on global warming. Quote from these oil companies, "Most scientists do not believe human greenhouse gas emissions are a proven threat to the environment or to human well-being, despite a barrage of propaganda insisting otherwise, coming from the environmental movement and echoed by its sycophants in the mainstream media." Wow. That was in the 80s. We have not progressed from there. The consequences of a nuclear war, well, remain unclear today. The uncertainty revolves mainly around environmental issues. Nobody can prove conclusively what Earth conditions will be like with the depletion of the ozone layer. And nobody knows for certain how long it will last. Some say, oh, it could be a bad year. Some say, stockpile your food for 2 years and then you'll be okay. And some say, the earth will be lifeless forever, simply revolving around the sun under the watchful eye of a God. No humanity, no art, no beauty. I somehow think it pure hubris to believe that in a nuclear catastrophe, humankind will somehow be spared. The end of the world exists as a possibility, and no amount of denial can ever remove that possibility from the table. And so the choice still hangs with us today. We need to act as we must. We need to act to abolish nuclear weapons. And then the end will be changed into a beginning. So be it. Let's turn our hymn books, please, to number 118 and add a little life into this congregation. 118. Even though we're going to extinguish the chalice, we're still going to let it shine. That's what we're going to do. Let us think how our rich and powerful nation proclaims itself the defender of freedom. But is it freedom we are defending? Is it perhaps not first and foremost the privileges that freedom has brought to us, and to us as Americans more probably than to anyone else? Freedom, as Camus taught us many decades ago, isn't made up principally of privileges, it's made up especially of duties. And if in America freedom's duties held sway over freedom's privileges, we would capture the capacity to once again imagine the moral and allow our souls to find peace in this world. Amen.